Good morning, everyone. Oscar Wilde once said, "Punctuality is the thief of time." And I appreciate all of you being punctual, and I don't like to deprive you of your time. So we'll start only a few minutes late, and more people will eventually turn up. This is a program we have every year in honor of the late Tim Gelatt. This is the 24th. Tim Gelatt was one of the brightest students I ever had. University of Pennsylvania, where he did his undergraduate work, couldn't say enough about him. He wanted to go to Harvard Law School, and they went all out to make sure we knew that. And it was worth it. He was a wonderful scholar, hugely energetic. I thought he wrote so much he must be writing with both hands simultaneously. And he wrote following the admonition of Chairman Mao to walk on two legs, 两条腿走路. He walked on two legs. He studied China's human rights, and he studied China's business law and development, and wrote about them simultaneously. He also practiced law after law school, sometime with my own law firm, and we did negotiations together. He had an added feature. He knew French. His mother was French, and we sometimes negotiated in three languages, which was something of a strain on me since, like Joe and Lai, I had studied in France in an earlier era. In any event, Tim was a wonderful person. He taught here for a number of years as an adjunct professor, and at age 39 had a brain hemorrhage that suffered his loss. He liked domestic law of China. He liked the international law of China. We've had programs featuring each aspect over the years. Today, we combine the two, and of course, in this world, it's increasingly likely that the two subjects merge, as we'll see in many respects. So that's why we have this program, and we hope in his memory we'll have a good day. This is a time of anniversaries. Next month, we have two important ones. One, as you know, is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which needs to be recalled more than ever. It's also, and this is for me especially exciting, the 40th anniversary of the meeting in Beijing in December 78 of the so-called Third Plenum of the 11th Party Central Committee, where Deng Xiaoping announced his leadership, and he told us that China would get over the Cultural Revolution and would establish a legal system as part of its reform and opening. And I was in Hong Kong at the time and reading the People's Daily every day, the announcements that came out. It was a hopeful time. And it initiated a decade of progress for China, albeit installing an essentially Soviet-style legal system. Now, this coming May, we have a very important anniversary. It's the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement was a huge cultural, political effort in China, partly in reaction to disappointment over the way China was treated at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. But the excitement of that time, the ideas generated, when you compare it 100 years later to the lack of intellectual excitement allowed in China, you wonder, despite all the phenomenal economic and social progress of China in recent decades, how far has it really come? Because there's no combination of circumstances that can reproduce what took place in the years after 1919 as China groped for modernization. Of course, we have a sober anniversary in June 4th, 30th anniversary of Tiananmen crisis, the tragedy, and China isn't yet recovered from that, which is why nobody's allowed to discuss it. So that's sort of the background for today. Now, further background is the world is now looking for a new international order. There's a lot of talk. Has Westphalia ended? Is it going to be Eastphalia? And if so, what is the content of that? We have a crisis in US-China relations that's getting ever worse. I was amazed as I came into the building a few minutes ago. One of our service personnel who was cleaning the street, obviously of East Asian origin, I think he's a Chinese born in Vietnam, he stopped and asked me about the APEC meeting and what has just happened in Papua New Guinea. I was just amazed because I always feel the American public is not sufficiently informed, but it's certainly reaching this person who was somewhat unusual. The only thing that Xi Jinping and President Trump seem to agree on at this point is that we're at a new crossroads. We are on the brink of a new era. It doesn't seem to be very optimistic. We know what all the political and economic issues are. There's very little basis for agreement. I personally think the Trump government is trying hard to shake the foundations of the communist government in China. There are some people in his entourage who believe that they can do for China what they claim Reagan did for the Soviet Union, create economic difficulties that will shatter the security of the regime. And China, unfortunately, through a whole range of acts that I think are misbehavior, is playing into the hands of these people. So it is a new era. And the question for us today is international law relevant? Of course it is, because it's part of the daily rhetoric in the angry exchanges that are taking place. But are international institutions relevant? Are international courts, arbitration tribunals, mediation prospects, are they relevant? Or are we all bystanders who simply have to sit by and wait for a kind of political and perhaps even military resolution of some of these questions? And if international legal institutions are to play a role, especially in East Asia, what should it be? We see in Western Europe some very developed regional legal institutions. We hear from the Court of International Human Rights and other institutions quite regularly. East Asia seems underfurnished, you might say, in this respect. And yet, is there any prospect for regional institutions? And would regional institutions make life better? Could it be? We often hear from China and sometimes others that Westerners are biased against the people of East Asia. That's one of the many excuses China gave for not taking part in the Philippine arbitration that began in 2013. Well, those are the kinds of questions we want to consider today, and of course, salient among them, although not much emphasized by the Trump government, is the question of human rights. I personally have been active in trying to alert people outside of China to what's taking place in Xinjiang area of China, as well as Tibet. But Xinjiang now, Tibet has been quieted by the methods now being applied to Xinjiang. And this is one of the questions I'm sure our next panel will want to discussed. I'm particularly pleased that among the many fine speakers, we have Judge Owada Hisashi here, old friend. We've known each other over 40 years. He taught for 2 years at Harvard. While he was ambassador to the UN, he also taught at NYU Law School. We joined together for 1 semester. And we have many other speakers. You may have seen Professor Alston's photo in yesterday's New York Times. He looked such a dashing figure, I thought Hollywood will enable him to put human rights into a broader population here. Let's hope so. In any event, I just wanted to say a few words before turning the panel over to the Human Rights Group. There's a new book out. It's called Historic Achievement of a Common Standard. It's a book by a professor at the Chinese University of Political Science and Law in Beijing, Professor Sun Pinghua. He's been here. His daughter got an LLM here about 3 years ago. And this is a book about the Chinese representative to the talks, the negotiations that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A man named Zhang Pengchun, and he was a philosopher, he was a statesman, he was a teacher, he was an activist, a compromiser, and a thoroughly terrific person I regret I was too young to get to know. But the book is a very interesting story of the negotiations among representatives of different civilizations and parts of the world to try to achieve this common standard for humanity. And it has a very good introduction, or forward, by Professor Mary Glendon of the Harvard Law School. I invited her to come today, but she was committed to talk in the Vatican about this declaration. It also has a, to me, even more interesting introduction by a friend of ours, Ira Belkin, knows him as well as others, Professor Yang Yu Guang. Very attractive, able, interesting person. I always like meeting with him. I always learn something from him. But in this forward, he tries to make it seem like this is China's contribution. This is even the People's Republic of China's contribution to human rights. And that indeed, if properly seen, the Universal Declaration is really a recent emanation of China's traditions. And even the previous Kuomintang government that Mr. Zhang Pengchun represented. Now that's just nonsense, of course. The irony is, Zhang was the representative of the Kuomintang government while he was negotiating for human rights for the world and doing a brilliant job. His government, the Chiang Kai-shek government that had moved into Taiwan in 1945, was just imposing the white terror that lasted for 3 decades. There could be nothing more contrary to the Universal Declaration than that. And of course, soon after the Universal Declaration came out, December 10th, 1948, the communist government took over, October 1, 49, and as they say, the rest is human rights history with which we will be grappling today. Well, I won't say any more. I wanted to make a transition to the first panel, and I very much look forward to hearing what Ira Belkin and our other colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and good morning to everyone. I'm very honored to be asked to moderate this panel. I think in an ordinary year, we have plenty to talk about human rights in China, but the past year, I would say, is anything but ordinary. we've seen just in the last 12 months some fundamental changes in the Chinese political system and human rights in China. And just to name a few, some of these things, as we think back, seem like they happened more than a year ago. You may recall Xi Jinping, through the National People's Congress, abolished term limits on his position. He is now the leader of China for life. We've started to learn about, as Jerry said, at the same time, the National People's Congress brought into being a new entity, the Supervision Commission, which has a very innocuous sounding name, but the Supervision Commission essentially has the power in corruption investigations to use procedures that haven't been seen since before 1986 in China. Lengthy periods of detention for investigation, repeated interrogation, all under the name of anti-corruption. As Jerry mentioned, what's happening in Xinjiang, which was first reported as perhaps the introduction of a new surveillance state, that surveillance procedures in Xinjiang were unprecedented. Since then, it's been reported that up to 1 million, possibly over 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in a new kind of re-education through labor camp, not called re-education through labor, but detention camps. And it's also been reported that about 1 million Han Chinese have been sent to Xinjiang to be so-called guests in the homes of Uyghurs to conduct both surveillance and education. There's also been, I hate to call it the usual suppression of freedom of expression, the arrest of lawyers, and all of these implicate fundamental human rights. And then we've had developments in how China engages with the rest of the world on human rights. The same day as Election Day, there was a Universal Periodic Review of China in the United Nations. Perhaps did not receive as much attention as our own midterm elections, but it was a significant event. And just recently, ambassadors from 15 countries sent a letter to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs protesting China's policies in Xinjiang. So each of these, I think, would be more than enough to occupy at least a panel of discussion, but it's our task to cover as much as possible just in one panel. Fortunately, we have an excellent, outstanding group of experts to help us talk through these issues. I'm not going to go through the details of each person's biography. It's all in your materials. But I'd just say we're honored to have Professor Philip Alston, who not only teaches at NYU and co-directs the Center on Human Rights and Global Justice, but is also a UN Special Rapporteur for extreme poverty and human rights. And I think in just the past 2 years, he has done extensive reports on China, the United States, and he recently just got off a plane from the United Kingdom where he was there as a special rapporteur. After Professor Alston speaks, Chen Yu-Jie will make comments. Yu-Jie is also a friend of NYU and a product of NYU. She's now a postdoc at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and she has done groundbreaking research on Taiwan's human rights review, its innovative procedure to conduct human rights review, even though it is not part of the United Nations system. And then also a product of NYU, as I am, Sharon Hom, also part of NYU and the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights, and Executive Director of Human Rights in China. So we'll have panelist presentations first, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So Philip, if you could start us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Ira. Just a quick point of information in response to Jerry's comment about meeting the cleaner on the way in here. As always, the explanation is self-interest. Louis has a son in the US Armed Forces and is very worried about geopolitical developments generally and the implications they may have for his son being deployed. So I'm really the least qualified person on this panel to speak about China and human rights. I have followed it for a long time, but from a great distance, except for the mission that I made a couple of years ago where I spent 2 weeks in China, met with a lot of different people, authorities and others, and produced a report to the UN. So my comments won't be nearly as familiar as Yu-Jie's and Sharon's in relation to current developments, but I'll try to look at it from a broader perspective, I suppose. China for a long time was, as Jerry said, was really only concerned with an anti-human rights policy domestically and not at all concerned with the international aspects of human rights policy. So through around 1980, China was not really a significant player in the UN setting. It then began a tentative exploratory engagement between 1980 and 1989. They started giving very serious consideration to ratifying key treaties, including the 2 covenants and so on. I remember being invited by the Academy of Social Sciences back in 1987 to Beijing to advise on what ratification might look like. And I took that as a rather serious effort. They'd gone to a lot of trouble. They were really exploring what the different provisions meant and the implications might be. But of course then came Tiananmen, and that put an end to that phase in relation to China's engagement. And it also led China to become very both defensive and offensive, but really only in relation to its own situation. It was subjected to what it saw as rather discriminatory treatment from the United States and some of its allies. Every year in the Human Rights Commission, as it was then called, there were resolutions presented calling for a condemnation of China's human rights record. And China, rightly in some ways, sorry to say this, felt that it really was being exposed to double standards because there was very little comparable effort to call major powers to account for their human rights violations. But of course, double standards are endemic to the human rights field, and so China shouldn't really have felt quite so aggrieved by that. But what it meant was that China then went on the offensive in terms of trying to transform the Human Rights Council or Commission, and it succeeded. But it was aided, of course, by the United States, John Bolton and others saying the Commission has lost all credibility, etc. Chinese singing along and saying, yes, you're right, it's lost all credibility. We need a replacement. And the replacement had a number of Chinese characteristics, if we can use the term inappropriately. The resolution setting up the council talked about the importance of dialogue, the importance of depoliticization, the importance of cooperation, etc. All of these were then counterbalanced by the emphasis from the West on the importance of responding to human rights violations and so on. But China did help to shape in a significant way the terms of reference for the new council. Subsequently, China kept its distance, I'd say, from the council. It eventually accepted a request to visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on torture. That Manfred Novak, that was only after his predecessor had made many requests and they were rebuffed. And the Novak mission, I think they didn't see as having been a particularly happy experience. He was very critical of what they were doing in relation to torture. And so there were very few visits by UN experts. Different high commissioners made major efforts to visit. They didn't come to very much. Surprisingly, in 2016, the Chinese government did invite me. The reasons for that are pretty straightforward. They saw my mandate, as we call it, my focus, to be one which was very favorable to them. A focus on extreme poverty could have led me to look only at their quite extraordinary efforts in eliminating or alleviating extreme poverty throughout China, the 600, 700 million people who have been quite lifted out of poverty. And that was enough for China to think that it would be a useful exercise. The challenge, of course, for me was to not play into the hands, I think, of either side. In other words, there were those who said to me, do not say anything positive about their record on poverty. You will simply strengthen their authoritarian tendencies and so on. That was extremely bad advice because if one is going to be honest, the Chinese achievement is spectacular. But of course China, on the other hand, said, and you shouldn't talk about anything other than poverty. At which point I said that in fact I was there to look at human rights and its relation to poverty, and that meant looking well, the way in which I then interpreted that was to not address head-on the broader range of political and civil rights violations, which will be talked about, no doubt, today on the panel, because, first of all, that wasn't my job, and secondly, there was more than enough material out there to satisfy anyone who wanted to understand the challenges that China faced in that regard. But what I did do was to say, okay, to take China on its own terms and say, okay, you think that economic, social, and cultural rights are really the most important. So let's see how you implement those. And I reached two principal conclusions. I think the first was that in its excellent work on poverty elimination, China does not really attach value to the concept of economic, social, and cultural rights as rights. It's a purely rhetorical gloss on a broader program to ensure some basic redistribution to those at the bottom of the income pile. And the second was that if there was a rights dimension to their policy on economic, social, and cultural rights, it would at least have an accountability dimension, which is really crucial to the whole notion of human rights. If you don't have some form of accountability, you don't have what I think of as human rights. And of course, having looked then at the various petition procedures and the way in which the courts operated and the administrative measures, it wasn't too difficult for me to conclude that China really didn't have meaningful accountability when it came to violations of those specific rights. A couple of things then have come out of the visit, I guess. The first, on the Chinese side, was the differences in what could be called the terms of engagement, not quite the rules of engagement, but the terms of engagement, where China made clear to me at the outset that I was there as an honored guest. And I don't know what you do with honored guests in your houses, but China apparently doesn't let its honored guests go anywhere without being accompanied or carefully surveilled. That was a problem. We were, of course, subjected to the fairly standard sort of surveillance. We had at least 3 people following us wherever we went. We had the wonderful situation, which was really funny to look back on, where my colleague from the UN, who arrived at our hotel in Beijing a little bit before I did, was told that her room wasn't ready and could she please wait. And she said no, she just got off a flight from Geneva. She was very tired. She really needed a room. Could they please give her a room? And she was quite insistent. So finally they handed over a key and she marched up to her room, only to be greeted by 3 men who were just coming out carrying a bag of tools. And they said, your telephone was not working, but we fixed it now. At which point, I'm pleased to say, she went back downstairs and said, I think I'd like another room, please. But of course, that turned out to be symptomatic, and as some of you will know, we met with Jian Tianyong, and we met with several of the spouses of the human rights lawyers who were detained. That led to retaliation against him and against others. And that, of course, goes directly against the whole terms of engagement with a member state of the UN. Since that time, it's been very interesting, because what we've seen, and I suspect we'll hear more about this from the next 2 speakers, is China's new engagement with the Human Rights Council. And curiously enough, I see this new engagement as even positive, but I'm taking a sort of long view. I'm taking, no doubt, the hardened UN human rights type view. I've seen a lot of authoritarian and repressive governments taking different attitudes to human rights. And for me, a degree of engagement is actually quite important. Even the book that Jerry referred to, which I haven't seen, for me is actually a positive sign. I have no doubt that Jerry's right when he says that, of course, this is a recasting of history and so on. But to the extent that it suggests some sort of engagement and even a desire for some sort of ownership, I'm happy for China to be a shareholder in the international human rights enterprise. With the exception of my own country, Australia, virtually every country is hypocritical in its engagement with human rights. In other words, they will say what suits them at a certain time. But the bad news is when you get to, say, the President Duterte of the Philippines position, where it's a total rejection, it's a total, a blatant violation of the various norms and obligations. And so at least hypocrisy has a certain virtue when there is a continuing engagement. And so even though China's 2 main initiatives right now, one is to say that really human rights are all about development, And so if you want human rights, what you need is development, and happens to be what we in China have. That's a big push, and of course it's trying to appeal to many states around the world who like that message. And the other one is their so-called win-win initiative, which goes back to cuddly, friendly dialogue and no hard action anywhere. I, of course, think those two positions are have some merit in theory, but very little merit in Chinese practice. But I don't think that should deter us from engaging and from seeing that as a legitimate effort by China to try to reframe the way in which human rights are discussed. I very much hope that those initiatives will not succeed, because I don't think they are well motivated. But I don't think a lot of the initiatives taken by the United States or by Australia are well motivated either in these areas. That's just the way the game is played. So I think my main point is that China has not sought to fundamentally undermine the system. And indeed, it may be the case that it is starting to see things through different eyes, thanks to our orange-haired friend. In other words, that multilateralism has advantages, that being able to bring up rights issues in a forum that actually functions is useful and will be useful to China in the future. So while the United States is walking away, refusing to engage, trying to undermine, trying to get rid of the International Criminal Court, trying to defund the human rights effort and so on, China is taking the opposite role. Just as we saw in Papua New Guinea, China is the great defender of the world trading order. So I can look at that with some degree of positivity, curiously perhaps. I think it's interesting to see, and I know that the next two speakers will talk about this process called the so-called Universal Periodic Review in the UN Human Rights Council. It's a very odd, bureaucratic / political sort of procedure, of which I was initially very skeptical, but which has turned out to be more significant than many of us expected. What it involves is a government reporting on its own record. These are all the great things we've done. These are all the people we've helped. There's a lovely phrase in there about, I don't think it's called relocation, but it says we have helped more than 8 million people living in poverty to move to different areas where they will be very happy. And of course, we know that a great many of those 8 million would have much preferred to have stayed where they were, but it's presented in a nice, shining light. You then get reports compiled from so-called stakeholders, which means civil society. And in those reports, it's interesting, you've got independent, impartial groups like the All China Federation of Trade Unions and various others making submissions, saying that China is doing a lovely job, but maybe should do a little bit more about certain aspects of labor law and so on. Of course, they are tame actors. They are feeding in what they know the government will be accepting of. But it's a form of engagement. It's pointing to certain issues that are live in China. And you've also got the opportunity then for other states to raise whatever issues they think are important. And some of those issues, it's funny if you look at it, Bolivia, for example, has ludicrous questions which look as though they've been translated into English from the original Chinese. But you've also got Western countries putting their finger on some of the really key and most sensitive issues. And even though we know that China is not going to say, you've got us, we've done bad things in these areas and we promise we'll stop, the government is forced to go on the record, forced to defend itself, and so on. So I won't say much more. I'll turn very briefly to some of the negatives, but I suspect this is not a message that would necessarily have occurred to some of you, that those of us who want to build an international human rights regime which has engagement at its heart, I think can take some degree of satisfaction or perhaps relief from the fact that the Chinese government has not chosen to try to destroy, which would have been a reasonable option at a time when the United States has abdicated all responsibility and interest, but instead has seen some value in keeping the system going in a reasonable way, and instead just trying to divert its direction, which, as I said, is a constant occupation of most of the countries that are engaging there. I won't talk about the full range of issues, but I think the set of issues that I'm getting most interested in these days, in some ways, relates to the role of new technologies, relates to artificial intelligence, and their impact on human rights. In my case, I'm particularly interested in looking at the impact on people living in poverty, which is not a dimension that is generally looked at by most experts in the AI field. People in poverty are the ones often, as with almost all human rights violations, are the ones most at risk. Systems are not designed to help the poor, but they are in fact designed to scrutinize, to surveil, to control the poor in ways that often exceed those that apply to other strata in society. And in China, you've got two of the most extraordinary sets of developments, which might be helpful, again, from the international perspective in terms of reminding all of us that the systems of big data, of automation, of artificial intelligence that all governments are now very excitedly playing with have potentially huge downsides. So Jerry mentioned the situation in Xinjiang, where the reports in the New York Times and elsewhere really are quite, George Orwell couldn't have imagined, I think, that a system would be as brilliant as the one that has been set up there in terms of the just constant electronic surveillance of everything that goes on, the use of all sorts of algorithms to identify who's doing what and where. But that then feeds into the much broader social credit system in China, which also has huge potential lessons for the rest of us, because many of our societies are moving in similar directions. The way in which data is used, the way in which the large tech companies are manipulating the ways in which we think, the information we receive, the packaging of news and so on. It's not as blatant as the social credit system. You're not yet going to be denied a ticket on Amtrak because your social credit rating comes up as low. But I think there will potentially be many ways in which those sorts of implications will start to become more common in the West. So to the extent that we can use China as a case study, which is particularly extreme, obviously, in really trying to control everything that everyone does in the society, that can only help to make us all more aware of the risks that apply beyond China. I'll leave it at that and turn over to the real experts on the situation.
Thank you, Philip. Appreciate your perspective on the UN process, especially, and also bringing a broader context into China, especially looking at the US. If you look at some of the public comments made by the US ambassador to the UN about the Human Rights Council, where she said the Human Rights Council was a, quote, cesspool of political bias. If you took some of those comments and weren't sure what country to attribute them to, you might mistakenly attribute them to decades earlier leadership from the PRC. So I think your point about China unexpectedly taking on the mantle of a globalist while the U.S. moves towards a nationalist is an important insight, and I hope we'll continue to look at that. So next I want to ask Chen Yu-Jie to comment and also talk about, I hope, a little bit about Taiwan.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm so glad to follow Professor Alston in order of speaking, because I really appreciate the positivities that he injected into into commenting the current situation, because I'm gonna inject a lot of negativities in my remarks, so that's quite a good balance. But I'm going to do this for a reason. I would say that I probably have a very different view from Professor Alston in terms of looking at what's happening with China and today's international human rights regime, and I'll explain why. So my starting point is really, now we're probably seeing a grave challenge to the UN human rights system. It's for the past, I would say, since 2013, you can see for the past years, China has been promoting a very distinctive human rights discourse to legitimate its human rights violations and to undermine global human rights principles. And I would say that this is probably nothing new, because you could see this trend maybe a decade or 2 decades earlier. But I think now China is increasing its efforts to really take more initiative to change the system that is surrounded by. And so the question for us, I think, is no longer whether China can be engaged, but whether China's illiberal discourse and its authoritarian agenda can be checked in the international human rights system. So that's my starting point. Just to briefly recount the background of China's attitudes towards the international human rights system, Professor Alston has already briefly discussed this, and I'll say we can probably generally divide China's attitudes into these four different periods, in fact. And I would say that we could see probably in the 80s there was a sort of really optimism in engaging China because until the June 4th massacre, I think the world community genuinely believed that China would be willing to play by the rules of the international system and abide by universal human rights standards in a gradual process. And then we see a very distinctive Chinese discourse that emerged in the mid-1980s that combined a new attitude, a very favorable attitudes towards universal human rights standards. So you could see that China began to ratify human rights treaties, take participation in the Commission on Human Rights, etc. On the other hand, its discourse also started to reflect the traditional concern of the PRC about foreign interference with its domestic affairs. And then, of course, June 4th happened, and at the time, the most immediate agenda for China was to avoid international censure at all costs. And that was what really preoccupied China at the time. And then now we are probably seeing a new era, and I'm using new era in Xi Jinping's terms. Xi Jinping's new era since he became the party secretary and president, took the leadership in late 2012, we began to see a more assertive and confident China on the international stage, and that's not necessarily a bad thing itself, but it's a bad thing if it undermines the fundamental principles that are embedded in the system, that are designed to be in the system to protect human rights. And this should be looked at in the context of China's new international discourse power project, 国际话语权, meaning that China is determined to have more say in international affairs. And if we look at China's practice in the international human rights system, I would say you could see quite distinctively how China's discourse and tactics are a little bit different from other countries. I agree with what Professor Alston said, that every country is trying to play the game to some extent and trying to defend its human rights records, etc. But here we see a China that plays the game a little bit differently. If we look at its norms, its discourse on norms and values, it emphasizes very much development, and it's not a rights-based framework for development, but rather it's a state-centered program of development. It emphasizes duties, collective rights, national conditions, saying that the national conditions of China are very different from other countries, and therefore we should not be examined by the same standards. And it emphasizes a lot sovereignty and non-interference with Chinese domestic affairs. On the tactics side, you see China has used a formalistic rhetoric to rebuff human rights scrutiny. So in treaty reviews, China would always cite laws and regulations on the paper instead of really discussing any concrete cases or practice. It also resorts to discrediting tactics, trying to undermine the credibility of civil society groups and independent experts. It partners with developing and authoritarian countries to support China's agenda, and it also accuses liberal democracies of politicizing human rights. I specifically want to focus on Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is an important global platform for human rights, although it's indeed a political battlefield, that a lot of its rules are designed to facilitate states to play political games rather than really allow meaningful scrutiny. However, I still think since this is the only game in town, we should look at it seriously. The US, as you know, withdrew from the Human Rights Council in June, and therefore people are starting to look at whether there's any evolving dynamics in the council. If we look at China's role in the council, it's actually quite active. So it was active in establishing the council, and it was a member from 2006 to 2012, and then its third term membership started in 2013. And since then, I think you see a growing voice of China at the council, and this should be understood in the context of Xi Jinping's ambitious agenda and its, as mentioned, international discourse power project, and also combined with China's economic interest and influence on other countries. On the other hand, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I think the Chinese leadership is very insecure about the current situation. Professor Jerry Cohen wrote an op-ed, I think, a few years ago on Washington Post discussing Xi Jinping as an insecure leader. And I think a lot of people overlook that. They see a strong China, but they don't really see the underlying why Xi Jinping or other Chinese officials are so nervous about rights activism in China. And so I do want to draw your attention to this aspect. So we see developments that indicate the insecurity of the Chinese leadership, such as a secret memo coming from the Communist Party saying that there are 7 taboos, 7 unmentionables that should never be discussed in public. And these include universal values, press freedom, civil society, citizens' rights. I've listed them here, independence of the judiciary. And you also see an intensified campaign of cracking down on human rights activists and human rights lawyers, starting from the famous 709 crackdown in 2015. Hundreds of lawyers and activists have been detained, interrogated, put in jail, sentenced heavily. And you see now with what's happening in Xinjiang with mass incarceration of Uyghurs and Kazakhs. If we examine China's human rights practice at the council, I think we can see them, we can see it in the 3 aspects, and they are procedures. China has used a lot of tactics to distort the procedures to play the game. The second part is institutions. I think there are efforts to undermine the institutional strength of the council and the system, including China's efforts to partner with Russia to restrict the special procedures mandate and the China's long-lasting position to avoid country-specific resolutions at all costs. The third aspect is norms and values, and this I want to discuss this concept of the so-called human rights under socialism with Chinese characteristics. This phrase was introduced in China's 2013 UPR report. What does this mean in practice? The concept has never been really elucidated or elaborated in the report. But I think if we look at, if we look at Chinese behavior in the international human rights system, I would say the so-called human rights with Chinese characteristics is just a rhetoric, anti-rhetoric for China to say that, look, we're really different from the West. We Chinese are different. It's basically playing an identity-based relativist politics with new labels. And it's saying these differences do not come from a matter of policy. They come from the differences in our identity. And because of this, we have a fundamentally different human rights philosophy from the West, and therefore, to use this, China could justify its different human rights practice. And I think what this does to the international human rights system is negative, very negative, because literally what China is saying, this gap between you and me is not reconcilable, and it's going to worsen political polarization at the Human Rights Council. So I have 2 more minutes. Let's see how I can get it done in time. Okay, let's look at, I think the major challenge is yet to be addressed right now. And this is why I disagree to some extent with Professor Alston. I do think the approaches of other countries, major political actors, are not really working for today's China. So let's look at engagement. It's really something that's so embedded in the international human rights system. Engagement is very important, but how do you engage a China that simply refuses to be engaged? There have been books and articles that discuss the frustration that happens in China's dialogues with other countries. So the dialogues are not really to facilitate engagement, but rather to rebuff engagement with very formalistic rhetoric. Okay, how about cooperation? Let's talk about cooperation. A lot of the cooperation programs that try to engage China are now considered by the Chinese government as hostile foreign forces. And so it's really hard to work on law reforms and rights activism in China domestically. So we have to think, and I pose this question, whether we still carry this outdated thinking about China, that China will eventually share the same goals with Western democracies of opening up its society, of engaging in political reforms, etc. And I do think it's outdated if we look at today's China, because as I said earlier, now China is very determined to embark on a very different path. And it's reflected in rhetoric that we, the Chinese, are different. So we have to ask if there's any better approach. We can certainly have more discussion in the Q&A, but I want to conclude my remarks with a question. So if they're saying we, the Chinese, are different, who are the Chinese who really understand the reality of human rights in China? Is it Xi Jinping? Is it public officials? Is it public security officials who detain human rights activists? Is it the diplomats working at the Human Rights Council? Is it the human rights lawyers who have been detained, tortured, and jailed for advocating peacefully reforms in China? Is it even more specifically Cao Shunli, an activist who tried to take part in the international human rights system in the UPR in 2013 and was detained before she could leave China and eventually died in the prison's hospital. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So thank you, Yu-Jie, for engaging with Professor Alston's view on China and the UN mechanisms, but perhaps having a different forecast about the outcome of China's activism, which frames our discussion nicely. Next, we'll hear from Sharon Hom.
Wrong PowerPoint. Let me see, what are we going to do? Yeah, sorry, it's the wrong one. Does it look like this one? Anywhere close? Let me see. Yeah, I think it might be, some of it is here. Okay, well, let's just open, yeah, let me.
So I think we're having a different issue with technology and human rights.
This looks like this movie. Okay, great. Let me, yeah, right. Which, do I need to point it at? No. Or do I point it at Jerry? Do I point it at? Yeah, let me get this. Anywhere. Great. Good morning, thank you. I have the difficult and easier job of being cleanup batter after really excellent, detailed, comprehensive remarks by Jerry and by Ira and from Professor Alston giving a really excellent, in such a short time, both locating China's engagement with the UN, and then Chen Yu-Jie did all the heavy lifting in terms of looking at very specifically China's engagement. So I think what I'm going to do, and I apologize for this first very negative image, Chaijian, which is forced demolitions, and then I'll back off from it a little bit, having been a little bit not persuaded, but provoked by Professor Alston's remarks about the positiveness of engagement. So I'll take this back, not totally, but I'll engage with the positive engagement aspect of forced demolition. So what I'm going to do is move very quickly on some of the high-level challenges, but I think I'll switch to a positive end in terms of Jerry's favorite question. And Jerry's favorite question in these conversations is usually this question. So what can be done? And I don't have the answer to Jerry's question, but I have a way to think about how we should think about what's to be done for very specific audiences. You, people in this audience, and I would say you meaning lawyers, China experts, military experts, researchers, and people who care about what's going to happen, is happening here and abroad and in the world. So I'm going to focus on how we can think about what can be done. Okay, Jerry? Okay. This is for you, Jerry, and for our wonderful colleague, Tim. So I would describe overall, the high level, China's challenge to the UN system as essentially, at this moment, out of a very complicated, nuanced history that has been already presented. But I would say that at this moment, it's attack and replace. It's an attack and replace strategy. And the very detailed way Chen Yu-Jie has already laid it out, it's an attack that's discursive, it's an attack that's based on replacing conceptual models, the fundamental models underpinning the UN system. And the third aspect of that attack is to work in very concrete, specific ways to change the procedures and the content of the human rights system. And that is backed by resources and money. So it's not an accident that at the UPR in the opening remarks by the Chinese representative, by the ambassador, that he also then puts in, and we're happy to be contributing another 800,000 to the Office of the High Commissioner's office. So that always gets thrown in, meaning, you know, there's resources that can be given, and there's also resources that can be taken away. So, okay, so in many ways, where we are at this moment of a fundamental contradiction, and what we have, for folks behind next to me, is Mao, Emperor Mao, half an Emperor Deng, and then Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao kind of ruling by somewhat consensus. And now we see very, very big president for life, Xi Jinping. So the convergence that many of us here have been participating in, trying to build rule of law, training, hoping for that convergence of China's development into something that looks like a Western liberal democracy with independent courts, independent, legal profession, etc. I think is becoming painfully clear is not going to happen. So the convergence between the engagement of China with the WTO, with the human rights system, that was going to come together with China playing by the rules is clearly not going to happen. What is happening is China is engaged in a very fundamental, breathtaking exercise of world building. It's a different vision of the world, and China is once again at the center, and they're building a different world with a different vision. And I thought the first thing I want to say about what we need to do in terms of how we think about what's to be done is we need to understand what that vision is. And we need to understand what the implications of that vision are for our conversation today, international human rights, policy, et cetera, et cetera. So having said that, I want to say that one of the things you see is it's a vision where China wants to present itself in the powerful figure of Xi Jinping as confidently striding out into the world, but striding out into the world from where? From the history, claiming thousands of years of Chinese history and claiming that as the Communist Party's own history. So thousands of years of imperial history is being claimed, and that's why you get the references to Confucianism. That's why Xi Jinping is going to Confucius's home, making speeches there. So it is claiming Chinese history, culture, values as part of, and conflating it with Communist Party values and history. So basically taking pre-1949, putting it all together and calling it Chinese culture. Some really excellent work that's provoked a lot of my own thinking and trying to strategize around it is being done by the Merrick's Institute in Berlin, and I commend that to you. This is one of the really excellent reports that was done, and it's by former journalist Didi Tatlow. And she calls it Cosmological Communism, and what she did was, brilliantly, in a very short piece, link imperial thought with Marxist ideology and said, this is not new. And so Tianxia, all under heaven, is now the community of a shared destiny. So it's looking like the same. The Tianchao, the heavenly court of imperial China, is really the Communist Party of China. And that the way, Jimmy, the way in which the vassal states were controlled in imperial China by paying tribute as well as getting benefits, you know, the bridling and haltering, is now called United Front, but I would add it's now One Belt, One Road. So it's looking like these infrastructure projects, military, economic, financial, technical assistance, cultural exchanges, they're all ways to build a whole new community, make no mistake about it, vassal states, of states which will be loyal to China, like at the Human Rights Council in terms of voting, and really will be contributing to China's world building. So this article is, I commend that to you. The second one I wanted to contrast a little bit, apropos of Professor Alston saying technology, is this is to show some of China's, and particularly the leadership. You know what this is? This is, even though Facebook is banned in China, this is Xi Jinping's Facebook page. So this is Xi Jinping's Facebook page after he went abroad, and an enterprising researcher took the likes that liked his page and created this visual representation. So you see where the big likes are, India, Pakistan, Myanmar, Philippines, and this was pointed out to me that some of those likes might be Shuijun, or like they could be the Water Army, they could be fake likes, they could be the Wu Mao, the 50 centers who are liking him too. But in any case, they're global. So this is the likes. In other words, while there's intense censorship, comprehensive censorship inside China using every single method, the leadership and the party is using the technology and they care. In other words, he cares that there's a lot of likes on his Facebook page. So there's a double, much more complex relationship to technology than simply we're going to use it to censor. They care about using it, and that's why all of the major government organs now have not Facebook pages, but have Twitter accounts, and actively engage, and they all post comments, etc. They're engaging in the social media space to shape it, to engage, to participate. So this is, I had said that the first point I want to make is it's really important to understand what this world making is. So this is another, Sabine Mokri is also a researcher at Merix, and she did this piece recently called Decoding the Chinese Concepts for the Global Order. Like, what do these concepts really mean? And I think she makes the very good argument that everyone is clear now that China has ambitions to reshape the world order, as it should, as an important influential actor. Everybody wants to shape where they have to operate. But what does it mean? And what she argues, and I agree with, is that even among experts, we have a limited understanding of what these concepts really mean. And so I think the first thing is we need more research and understanding of it, and researchers like at the Merix Institute are actually pointing out some of the implications of this. So one of the conclusions she comes to on this first cut, which is a very short cut look at it, is that me? I mean, me meaning my time is up? No.
No, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap to the positive part, okay. 5 minutes, so China's, this global leadership among Chinese researchers, so this is what she looked at, Chinese researchers looking at this global discourse concluded, she said, that they take for granted that China's going to step into global leadership. So the only debate is which ideals should govern. In other words, it's a battle about ideals and values. And this is important because those values and those ideals and that world vision is going to is shaping its foreign policy, its engagement, and its efforts to shape the UN system. Now, if we're having trouble understanding the concepts and Xi Jinping thought, we're not alone. So here is David Bandersky, one of my favorite China watchers, did a whole article on mapping Xi Jinping thought. Does this look incomprehensible? He took each part of Xi Jinping's thought, and this is what official Chinese media are publishing to try to explain all of the different implications of what Xi Jinping thought looks like when you apply it to, for example, Area 7, the media. So this is quite complicated. So if we're trying to figure out what the party is doing in the Xi Jinping thought sessions, what they're studying, what they're like trying to understand, this is what it looks like. So they're probably getting a handout going, now everyone look at number 6, and now we're gonna follow it down, and this is what it means for your work. What does it mean for your work as the media? You can't publish anything that hasn't been vetted by Xinhua. What does it mean if you're in the legal profession? It means you work and the prime directive is loyalty to the party and ensuring Xi Jinping thought. What is disloyal? What is national security threat? anything that diverges from Xi Jinping thought, but the first thing we have to do is understand what it is. So it is not as simple as we think. Okay, so Yu-Jie has already talked about what the different, discursive strategies are. And this is my second point about what's to be done. Yes, we all hear this at the UN quite frequently, but what needs to happen is principled responses to this kind of discourse and these kinds of concepts and models being introduced. So there was a direct rejection of Professor Alston's approach to development. He said development to be sustainable must be within a rights-based framework. China has very clearly said no, we don't follow that. We believe in a people-centered, and people is conflated with party. Like, how do you know what the people want? We'll tell you. Like 80 million will tell you what the other billion something want. So the first thing is this language must be stopped. So the resolution in March 2018 that Yu-Jie referenced, that was an example of not a principled response to when this kind of language is introduced in a resolution. Xi Jinping thought was in a resolution at the UN. And all the Western democracies, the usual suspects, got up and said things like, this is terrible. We can't have Xi Jinping ideological thought in a UN resolution. So they all, one after another, say things on and on. What happened when the vote came? The vote came and they abstained, except for the US. The US voted no after saying very clearly, okay, now I got conflict. Ira says I have 2 and you say I have 1. So I'm gonna take Ira's 2 minutes, okay? So what is the point of abstaining? This is my point. The frozen deer in the headlight strategy is not gonna work because it didn't end well for the deer. And what we need to do is a mental strategic reset, and that's what we did at the UPR last week. Prior to the UPR, we lobbied the usual suspects and then some not so usual suspects like Pakistan. That was quite an experience for us, right? So we lobbied about 24 governments to say, this is really urgent. You need to stand up for universal values. That's the whole fundamental foundation. If that goes, it's gonna start crumbling. And only Australia raised in its advanced questions the universalism question and said, what do you mean? What is your real attitude towards universalism? So we were very appreciative, at least it was raised, right? So let me quickly go to the end, and these are the concepts. And what I want to say about the concepts is that one of the attacks on the concepts is that they're Western. That's what China's saying. They're Western and no longer appropriate for the world today, and in particular the global South, and that the global South and the developing countries have really suffered under this Western model. And that is extremely important on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because number one, the Universal Declaration, if we think back, post-World War II, it was in the shadow of the Holocaust. And the purpose of these universal values and the whole structure that then emerged of the human rights system was to ensure that never happened again, that people would not be rounded up in camps, based on ethnicity or religious belief, and then be disappeared, eradicated from the world. It was meant so that would never happen again. That's why universalism is very important. Now, the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights did an excellent report that came out in July of this year, and she did a report on universality, cultural diversity, and cultural rights. And this is my key takeaway from that very important report. 1, cultural diversity is not in tension with universality. In fact, they are interrelated and they need each other. Secondly, this notion that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the human rights sphere came from Eleanor Roosevelt and the West is only partially true, and that in fact, feminists, anti-colonial feminists from the global South actively participated in the drafting. So not only, if you want to say the KMT, the China in its previous life, but women from the global South, activists from the global South, actively participated in the drafting of the standards, the language, and we really should be claiming that back. It's claim back that history. It's not a Western document. It was an intercultural, universal document. So, yes, these are all the challenges of the UPR, that yes, it's a bureaucratic, yes, all the states are hypocritical, and yes, they're all engaged in geopolitical engagement that is for their own self-interest. I take that as sort of a given, but not completely, because I do believe, despite many data points to the contrary, that in fact, states do have values that they believe in, and that they do sometimes stand up for them. And so I'll let you see. Here are the 3 UPRs of China, and you'll see that each one, it's a work in progress. 2009 was a dumpster fire. And then October 2013 one, there was a little bit of a change. What was the change? 137 states signed up. They each got 50 seconds each. The first one, 111 states signed up, but because they didn't put a time limit, only 60 got to speak, because then the time was over. Now, in 2018, which is the one we just had, 153 states spoke up, time divided equally, so it was 45 seconds. So I agree with Professor Alston that when we look at China and we try to assess it and gauge China constructively, we should recognize positive. But when you have 45 seconds and you spend 35 of them saying, and we want to appreciate the enormous progress made in eliminating poverty that was said over and over, and the incredible models, and it goes on, and I'm looking at the clock, you got 10 seconds now. Like, what are you gonna say? So that happened a lot to the like-minded states and the countries who supported China, but look what happened. 15 states raised human rights defenders, and the US was the only one, even though they left the council, they didn't leave the UN, they raised individual cases. They raised Tashi Wanchuk, Ibram Toti, Huang Qi, and Wang Quanzhang. They raised them by name in their 45 seconds, bless them, and 21 states, I think maybe, 21 states mentioned Xinjiang, but they were on different levels of moral and political courage. Some of them said, we're concerned about something happening there. Some of them said, these are political camps. Some of them said, but the recommendations, that's very important, is they said there were recommendations, close down the camps, ensure full access by the UN, by the High Commissioner, by the procedures. That's what they called for Xinjiang and also for Tibet and religious freedom. The 25 states mentioned, again, rule of law and lawyers. So I think on balance, it is a bureaucratic procedure. It is really problematic, but it is in progress. And if we do the kind of work we need to do, we can actually make a difference. Okay, so I'm going to end with my last point. That point, in case you missed it, was the UPR is bureaucratic, the UN is bureaucratic, but it still can be useful to raise the issues, raise awareness, and ask for concrete things to be done. That was in case people missed what my second positive point was. So my last point is that we need to support the people who are going to make a difference in China. And we need to continue not only the supporting the lawyers, but at the UPR, it was the Uyghur groups, it was the Tibetan groups who did the lion's share of the work raising the issues. And we talk about Uyghurs, but my colleagues and I in Geneva, we talked to groups from Kazakhstan, and they told us 1.6 million Kazakhs are living in China, and they estimate 500,000 of them are in the camps. So we're talking between the ethnic Uyghurs and the Cossacks and other Muslims, we're talking possibly 1.5 million to 2 million in the camps. And in these camps, talk about the US is not the only country advocating alternative realities and fake facts, because at the UPR, the Chinese delegation read excerpts and quotes from inmates of, well, they call them the participants in the camps. And these were one of the comments. They said, because they had such amazing activities in the camps, that they didn't realize life could be so colorful. That's what they read. And you know, the fact that they weren't just laughed out of the room, people said, wow, so they're getting to do constructive things and learning colorful ways to live and be. So I think at the end of the day, these are some of the upcoming opportunities, and I think for groups here I know who are working on supporting different civil society groups in China, there are opportunities not only to participate in a state-centric process like the UPR, but for the more independent treaty bodies. Last thing is that at the UPR, China announced that they would invite the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disabilities. Unfortunately, they didn't really learn the lesson from Professor Alston's visit, because they thought, we'll invite the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, because that mandate is favorable to us and we're doing really well. So they invited the Special Rapporteur on Persons with Disabilities and Rights of Elderly, because they think, I think, that they're going to do really well on that visit. And I think that there are so many issues, and we need to work with civil society groups working on these issues. And I'll look forward to the conversation to see how we can do that together. Thank you, thank you. Oh, sorry. This last slide is for Peter Dutton. That's just for Peter Dutton, who is speaking later in the day. And Peter says he will disagree with me or whatever, but I'll put it out. This is the One Belt, One Road. Everyone thinks it's an infrastructure project. I have been suggesting, if you look at where the port cities are, that China's expanding not only discursively, conceptually, but it's building out its naval power and its military power. And the fact that these countries are going to be debtor states to China, they don't care, because they're going to own those ports. And if you own those ports, that's where you put your aircraft carriers to land. And I think Peter disagrees, but I look forward to hearing you disagree.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Sharon. I think I opened by saying we could have discussed this topic all day, and I think I've been proven correct. Think about the questions that you'd like to ask, and while you're doing that, I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to ask the first question. One of the things I got from all of the presenters is that we are in a time of change, a fundamental change, and I want to slightly change the topic of our panel, which is China and the international human rights regime in the age of Trump. I just want to add, and in the age of Trump and resistance to Trump. One of the things that seems to be happening that is part of the change, I would put under the umbrella of populism. I think for a long time, human rights activists have operated under the belief that human rights are popular, and that's certainly true to a certain extent. Even China is promoting the idea through the book that Jerry mentioned and other activities commemorating the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, trying to come under the mantle of that populism. But specific policies which are clear violations of human rights in China and the United States also are finding popularity. We hear from many of our friends in China that the policy in Xinjiang is actually very popular among Han Chinese, that they feel that there's a tremendous threat of terrorism, so whatever's being done to keep them safe is popular. The Supervision Commission, which we haven't talked about much, is popular because corruption is very unpopular, and so taking extreme measures to combat corruption is popular. And I would say these are analogous even to the anti-immigration policies in the United States, which may not be popular in this part of the country, but seem to be very popular among the base that supports this administration. So my question is, in this age where regimes are violating human rights, but choosing policies that have some purchase among significant parts of the population, what can be done to mirror Sharon's framing of Jerry's question? This appears to be a new challenge to human rights promotion, and what should be done about it. So I ask each of you if you want to respond, and then after the responses are finished, we'll take questions from the audience.
I'll go first. Yes, indeed, a lot of the policies in China are very popular or appear to be very popular nowadays, but I just want to add a cautionary note that we don't really know how popular they are, because it's very hard to look into the perception of Chinese on these issues. And don't forget the domestic censorship that screen every news report that's read by millions of Chinese. And therefore, it's hard to have a meaningful debate of what the society the Chinese would want to become. So you would have a sort of, I guess, an apparent, a surface or facade of popularity. And we need to bear in mind that while this looks to be the case, it's all quite not transparent. The other thing I would mention is I agree with Sharon's approach to promote civil society development in China, to promote diversified voices, to allow different voices to be heard in China and beyond China. However, it's also becoming more and more difficult. And I think one of the things that international human rights community should be focused on is probably not the Human Rights Council, not these global platforms, but use these platforms to really give domestic voices a platform to be heard globally.
Okay, Philip, Sharon, do either one of you want to comment on this?
No, you go ahead.
I actually feel like that is new and it's not new, that racism, homophobia, fascism, authoritarianism, sort of death, destruction kinds of forces, I don't think they're new. And I think they've been with the world as long as, these two-legged species, have been on the planet. But I do think what makes it new is the speed and the scope and the impact of these ideas and the way in which these ideas can mobilize people, or disinformation to mobilize people. So I think that's really the world we're living in, where, in 1 second, 12 million people will have read a fake report and think it's real. I think that's what is different about the dimension. I think Yu-Jie's point is excellent, that whenever we talk about more restrictive regimes, and including regimes, I won't put an adjective to it, but like the US, I think we need to be very careful about what do we know, how do we know it, and how do we know it's true? So I think those are challenges that both Chinese people inside China and I think people in the US, we share. We really don't know what to make of the onslaught of information, and how do we assess that? So I think that's important. And the thing that I think is also, I want to point out about that is that there's space in China. And I feel very strongly about that we have to be very careful not to view China through the lens of media reporting, whatever media reporting. And that when we go down very granular to people level, like on the ground level, I think we feel very strongly that there's space and people are using that space, but the space isn't static. The civil society space to make a change, whether it's within the law schools or the courts or within a court case or within even journalists working within incredible restrictions, there's space. But the space is like a moving ping, ping, like it's moving. And it could be big, it could be small, and then it disappears. So partly the challenge in supporting civil society is that we have to just stop and listen and watch before we figure out that's the most useful thing to do. Because I think when we do that, just stop and listen and watch, we're actually hearing very concrete things that people on the ground are saying, no, we don't want that. I know people think we do, but we don't need that. We need X. So I think that's the real important kind of response to this kind of nationalism and this, those very, very negative trends that's not just in the US and China. It's global. It's really global trends. And I think the way to do it is really to go back to people. Like, Americans need to be more informed. Chinese people need to be more informed. We all need to be able to work together in a more, like, freedom of association, in a way that's safe and sustainable. I'll leave it here.
Ira, you mentioned a couple of things. First of all, the vilification of ethnic groups and the use of security rhetoric to trump human rights. Yes, I'm sure those two phenomena are happening in China, but they're happening almost everywhere else as well. Yu-Jie questioned whether they're popular. I think her general point's right, but I'm sure they are popular. There's nothing we all like more than vilifying other groups. The mobilization of the security fears is a standard technique being used by governments around the world. It's very prominent in the Australian debate, where the Australian government has pushed absolutely outrageous security measures in a context where there have been very few serious threats of any sort. I think this is partly a response to the presentation, particularly by Sharon. I think there are lessons to be learned from recent history. For me, the most important one is that the certainties that we have about geopolitical development are very uncertain. What we've seen is the overturning of so many assumptions about the role of different countries around the world. The Russian government was on the ropes, was about to disappear 10 years ago, according to newspapers. The United States was triumphant 30 years ago, 20 years ago. The European Union was going ever upwards. The Philippines was solidly in the democratic camp, etc. I think when we look at China, it's a mistake to think that, to accept Xi Jinping's line that this is an inevitable upward trajectory of history and there's no stopping it. Good things don't happen when dictators emerge in countries and try to control absolutely everything. Over time, the sort of spaces that Sharon talked about begin to open up. There will be cracks. It just defies history to say that this is just going to go in one direction. When I look at one road, one belt, I've always been concerned by it. I don't doubt that it is essentially what Sharon describes. But when you look at what's happening in Sri Lanka, when you look at what's happening in various African countries and so on, one belt, one road is going to come back to haunt the Chinese. You can't be foisting gigantic loans in a completely non-transparent way on countries all around the world and expect that they're all going to go along saying, this is great, we really appreciate the new imperialism. Because the benefits are one-off. The benefits are going to the governments currently in place, and the immense burdens will be inherited by the next generation. And they won't be saying, China is great, let us all vote for them in international fora. So I think we need to have a little bit of perspective on all of this. I know it's hard. I know those of you who are fighting right now against the huge violations of rights that one sees in China can readily be despondent, but I think it is important to learn the broader lessons of history. I'll just answer my telephone and then... and one last point. In Ira's question, in the field of human rights, I think many of us are spending all of our time looking at what the future of human rights is, trying to work out what approaches need to be adopted. It's clear that we haven't come up with a very successful formula in past decades for all of the self-satisfaction that many of us have evinced. I think it does come back, again, as Sharon said, there's no substitute for grassroots mobilization. Human rights has always been a combination of the generation of values from top down, but their resonance with people on the ground. And if they don't resonate, then they come to very little. I think to go back, the technology development is extremely important. All around the world, tech is determining how people see things, how they are influenced, and we need to come to grips with how better to control or influence that. And finally, I think there's the challenge of trying to And this is also as relevant in China. It's certainly very relevant. I've just been to the United Kingdom, as Ira mentioned, for the last 2 weeks. And in the United Kingdom, a lot of people said to me, and I think they're right, don't talk about human rights, because human rights are considered to be for drug dealers, terrorists, criminals, maybe asylum seekers, and a few other losers. But they're not for us. They're not for the real people. And I think that's the message that we need to recover, is that human rights really are for everyone. And there needs to be a broader notion of human rights, and it's not only something that is protecting those who are very much on the margins of society, even though it's central for them as well.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. We have a distinguished audience as well as a distinguished panel. I see Ko-Yung Tung, Helena, Peter, and although I see you every week, I can. So I think just those 4 questions, and that will probably take up our time. Please identify yourself and also keep your questions very brief. So can we give them the microphones? Ko-Yung Tung here in the first row, and then Helena. And
Thank
then
you. I'm
Ken and
Ko-Yung Tung, formerly with the World Bank. This question may be rhetorical, so you are not obligated to answer this. But if you can in 3 seconds or 45 seconds, you're allowed to do that. I'm sorry. I know that we in this room think alike, I think. But I'm thinking about 3 weeks ago, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations with Jerry, and there was this conversation about Chinese economy. And most economists think that economies will converge. Many human rights people think human rights will converge. And the question is, what does it converge to? Now, the Chinese may say, oh, human rights are Western concepts. But when we're talking about universal human rights, Western concepts of human rights, and non-Western ones, among them Chinese, are we seeing any convergence, or are we identifying the divergence of non-Western ones? Because we do conflate Western human rights concept with universal ones. And are those different? Are they converging? Are they diverging? And how about the others? So I think that there is a tendency of calling out concepts which are not Western, and to say that they violate universal ones. And I think they are, all 3 are different. And I'm saying that there are more than 3, but that's my rhetorical question. Thank you.
Thank you. Helena, here in the first row.
Hi, thank you for this very interesting discussion. There isn't very much time, I realize, but Yu-Jie, I think if you'd had more time, you would have spoken about Taiwan, and if there's a way to just briefly summarize some main points, I'd appreciate that.
Okay. And Ken Lieberthal and Wasserman.
Sorry, Helena Kolenda with the Luce Foundation here in New York.
Ken Wasserman. I'm active in the U.S.-Asia Law Institute. I'd be interested in Professor Alston's perspective on this. If you would agree that any vote by the General Assembly today on a universal declaration for human rights would have a very different result than the present document, to what extent, if any, does that say something about the concept of universal human rights, and why?
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Thanks. I'll be quick. If it's normal, as I think in one way or another all 3 of the speakers said, if it's normal for great powers to want to influence favorably the international environment, What should we accept as legitimate about the PRC's human rights approaches that we should then incorporate into the human rights canon? Sorry, I'm Peter Dutton. I'm a U.S. Asia Law Institute senior fellow and partner in crime with Jerry Cohen.
All right, so those are 4 easy questions. I'm sure our panel will have no trouble answering them in the 3 minutes we have left.
I'll go with the Taiwan question very quickly. So there's indeed a lot to be learned from the Taiwan experience, and I'm not saying that China will follow the path of Taiwan, but if you look at their experiences, there are similarities. So for example, right now what's happening in Xinjiang with re-education camps, Taiwan used to have a system to punish the so-called liumang hooligans, and they, at the time, the authoritarian regime also resorted to a police-dominated procedure to put these so-called liumang into the so-called training institutes, which is the term that the Chinese government uses now to say we're re-educate these Uyghurs and Kazakhs. So if you look at the possible reforms of Taiwan, some indeed can be useful references and comparative experiences, but I also realize that Taiwan's legal reform really didn't begin until it really started democratization process. So this is the perennial debate of if it's legal reform first, political reform later. Can legal reform stimulate political reform, or political reform has to happen before real meaningful legal reform happens? And we've had many of these conversations. My personal view is that without major political opening up, it's hard to have a real dialogue about legal reform. Taiwan also provides a bastion for, perhaps a base for activism in China. Now that the space in China is shrinking, a lot of the NGOs have moved their bases to Taiwan to engage with China. We also see when the Chinese scholars and practitioners have a dialogue with their Taiwanese counterparts, the communication is always easier than with the US counterparts. So I would say that's a very valuable role Taiwanese community can play in facilitating change in China.
So our time is up, but if we could just take maybe just a minute to ask each of you. I would summarize the 3 other questions as being raising the question of universal values. Should universal values be reconsidered and incorporate some other idea promoted by others, including China? If we could just have maybe just a quick response from each.
I'll give my time to Sharon and Professor Alston.
Thank you.
I'd like to hear you talk about the GA vote first. I'd like to hear you from you. You're not going to talk about that? You won't answer that?
Sharon's trying to get me into the General Assembly. I think I have a simple answer to all 3 questions, believe it or not, and that is that we need to understand what the real nature of what I'd call the human rights enterprise is. Human rights are not actually universal truths, as much as we would like them to be. Human rights is an attempt to enshrine universal values, but those values inevitably evolve, they change. Values, I would say, in the United States Constitution, and I'm not being critical here, I'm not saying it's been downhill, but they have evolved in a whole range of ways. They're not, despite all the nonsense about originalism and so on, they're not the sort of values that the founders necessarily held true. They have evolved very significantly. Racism, homophobia, whatever else, but in many other ways. And human rights are the same. It's a process of trying to negotiate the evolution of values and the endeavor to make them universal within a political system. And therefore, there's movement, and China's part of that as much as the United States.
I want to say something just quickly that addresses all the three questions as well. And I think that Professor Alston's absolutely right to put the finger on that. It's about a process. And I think when we think about the UN and the challenges that China poses, it's not a static that there's going to be a vote and then we're going to have a new system. And that there's so many actors in there, including not just states. I think we all think of governments and member states. But for example, on the technology, there's a whole initiative that has been developing around the human rights obligations of business enterprises and multinationals, and particularly in the technology sector. So I think the answer to what the future look like is, I think there is a core that can never change about human rights. I agree that it's not I'm not sure about truth being universal or not, but I do think there is one core value at the bottom, and that core value is the system of human rights is about people. It's about human beings as human beings, and that system, whatever else we do, however treaty bodies, whatever procedures we develop, whatever the treaty, all of those operationalizing of the system, which is very complex and in process, I think what cannot change is that the core of the system was about human dignity. And the core of human dignity means something. So I think that's where I think the bottom line is, where I think it's like when you start trashing human dignity, then I think that's not a change that we can seriously consider. So that's what I would say. I would say, human dignity is at the core. And then the other huge actor, of course, within the UN system is civil society, and that there are real debates and initiatives to limit the participation of civil society, and that's why it's not about all the states will vote. I think all the actors, civil society, NGOs, academics, foundations that are involved in these efforts, academics, experts, I think we all have a role in that process. And so it's like, should we accept China's, et cetera, et cetera? China's going to get accepted, its vision, to the extent it can convince, or more than convince, intimidate, but let's say convince the other actors that its vision is the one that should be adopted and operationalized. And I think that's where the battle is.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end a fantastic discussion about international law, human rights in China in this age, whatever we want to call it. And part of the right to human dignity is to have a coffee break. So in that spirit, we'll close this part of the discussion. I want to thank our panelists.